My future mother-in-law secretly turned my family business into her family's payroll. The divorce exposed every fake employee my future mother-in-law started stealing from my family's business 4 months before she ever technically became my mother-in-law, and it took a divorce, 11 years later, to finally prove it. I want to start there with the timeline, because the timeline is the whole story. Anne Marsh didn't wait for a wedding to start treating Foster and Sons like it belonged to her family too. She just got started early, and she was patient enough, and careful enough, that it took me over a decade to see the whole shape of what she'd built inside my own company. Foster and Sons is a residential and light commercial construction firm my father, Robert Foster, started in 1988 with 2 trucks and a business loan he almost didn't get approved for. I grew up around that company, the way some kids grow up around a family farm. I knew the crew by name before I knew most of my cousins. I took over as general manager in my late 20s, and eventually as majority owner when my father's health made him step back. And by the time any of this happened, Foster and Sons employed around 40 people and did close to $9 million a year in revenue. I say all that not to brag, but so you understand what was actually at stake and how much room there was inside a company that size for someone patient to hide in the margins. I met Kevin Marsh at a friend's barbecue when I was 26. He was easy to like immediately, funny without trying too hard, the kind of person who remembered which of your coworkers annoyed you and asked about them by name months later. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and I said yes without a single doubt, which I think about now with a kind of exhausted irony, because the doubt I should have had was never really about Kevin. It was about his mother. Diane made an impression on me almost immediately, and for a long time it was a good one. She hosted a dinner about a month into Kevin and me getting serious, and she'd clearly done research. She knew my father's company by name, asked informed questions about residential permitting and the construction market in our area, mentioned she'd done bookkeeping for a couple of small contractors over the years, and understood how tight margins could get in that industry. I remember thinking, driving home that night, how lucky I was that Kevin's mother actually seemed to understand the world I came from, instead of treating construction like something beneath polite conversation the way some people did. I didn't yet understand that her understanding of the industry wasn't just professional interest. It was reconnaissance. Anne Marsh worked as a part-time bookkeeper for a handful of small local businesses, which is how, about 4 months into Kevin and me dating seriously, she ended up doing some overflow accounting work for Foster and Sons during a busy season when our regular office manager was out on medical leave. My father liked her. She was competent, she was friendly, she made a point of learning everyone's name in the office within a week. I liked her too, at first. I wanted to like her because she was going to be my mother-in-law, and I'd grown up watching my own mother struggle with in-laws who never fully accepted her, and I didn't want to repeat that pattern from the other side. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that during those first few months covering payroll, Diane had done something quiet and specific. She'd added a name to our payroll system, not a real employee. Name, a social security number that belonged to her sister-in-law, Brittany, who did not work for Foster and Sons in any capacity, and a direct deposit routing number that fed into an account Diane had access to. The amount was small at first, barely noticeable against a payroll of 40 real employees, a few $100s every 2 weeks under a job title, administrative support, vague enough not to raise questions if anyone happened to glance at a report. That's how it started. It did not stay small. Over the following several years, even after our regular office manager came back from leave, Diane found reasons to keep her hands in our books. She volunteered for the annual audit prep. She offered to help reconcile accounts during tax season, always framed as a favor, always framed as her just wanting to be helpful to her son's future in-laws. My father, who trusted people probably more than he should have, let her. I was busy running crews and bidding jobs and, frankly, planning a wedding, and I didn't look closely enough at who exactly was touching our financial systems and how often. I remember one specific afternoon, about a year after Kevin and I got engaged, when Diane showed up at the office with coffee for everyone, unprompted, the way she did fairly often by then, and spent an hour helping Lisa reconcile some vendor invoices. I walked past the back office and saw the two of them at the computer together, Diane pointing something out on the screen, Lisa nodding along, and I remember feeling a small, warm rush of gratitude, thinking here was a future mother-in-law who actually wanted to be part of the family business instead of standing outside it. I had no framework yet for imagining that warmth as camouflage. Looking back with everything I know now, that particular afternoon lines up almost exactly with when Cody's name first appears in our payroll records, 7 months before Kevin and I even got married. By the time Kevin and I got married, 3 names had been added to our payroll that didn't correspond to real work. Brittany, Diane's sister-in-law. Cody, a nephew of Diane's who was 19, and as far as I could tell, spent most of those years working part-time at a car dealership 2 towns over, not swinging a hammer for Foster and Sons. And eventually, a third name, Gary, Diane's brother, who did occasionally show up on job sites, enough that if you'd asked any of our actual crew members, they might have vaguely remembered seeing him around, which made him the hardest of the 3 to catch, because there was just enough truth mixed into the lie to make it plausible. I want to be honest about something here, because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was simply an innocent bystander for 11 years. I had doubts about Gary specifically, more than once. I remember asking my office manager, a woman named Lisa who'd been with us almost as long as my father had been in business, why Gary's hours never quite lined up with any specific project code. Lisa told me Diane handled his timesheets personally, that it was easier that way since Diane already understood his schedule. I let that answer satisfy me because pulling the thread felt like accusing my husband's mother of something ugly, and I didn't want to be the daughter-in-law who caused that kind of rift, especially once Kevin and I had kids of our own and family gatherings became more frequent, more necessary, more full of people I didn't want to alienate over a hunch I couldn't prove. There was a specific moment, at our son's 4th birthday party, that I've replayed more times than I can count since Patricia's report landed on my desk. Gary was there, at the party, helping my father grill, easy and familiar the way he always was at family things, and my father made some offhand joke about needing to put Gary back to work on the Hendricks job come Monday. I remember laughing along, and I also remember a small, specific flicker of confusion, because I'd reviewed the Hendricks job costing sheet myself 2 weeks earlier and hadn't recognized Gary's name on the crew list. I told myself I'd just missed it, that Diane probably handled that particular allocation, and I let it go before the thought had even fully finished forming, because the yard was full of balloons and my son was about to blow out candles, and it did not feel like the moment to go interrogate anyone about job costing. That's the isolation this story runs on, if I'm honest. Not isolation from Kevin, not exactly. Isolation from my own instincts, because every time something felt off, I talked myself out of investigating it, because investigating it meant risking a family relationship I'd worked hard to maintain for the sake of my marriage. Deanne was skilled at that particular kind of pressure too. She'd bring up, casually, how much it meant to her that our families had blended so well, how rare that was, how she'd seen so many other marriages strained by in-law conflict. I understand now that those comments weren't just warmth. They were also, whether she meant them that way or not, a kind of insulation, reminding me constantly what I stood to lose if I ever pulled too hard on a thread. Looking back, I think there was also a simpler force at work, one I'm less comfortable admitting. I liked being the daughter-in-law who got along with her mother-in-law. I'd watched my own mother spend 20 years quietly at war with my father's mother, and I'd promised myself, in the vague way you promise yourself things before you actually know what a marriage requires, that I'd do it differently. Diane made that promise easy to keep, right up until keeping it cost me $200,000. The marriage itself started fraying around year 8, slowly at first, the ordinary erosion of 2 people who'd stopped being curious about each other, and then faster, once Kevin admitted he'd been unhappy for a long time and didn't see a version of us that worked anymore. I won't pretend the divorce was some clean, blameless thing on my end. I'd thrown myself into the business for years in a way that left less of me at home than there should have been, and Kevin wasn't entirely wrong to feel like he'd been living with a woman who was married to Foster and Sons first and him second. We separated when our kids were 7 and 5. It was sad, and it was mutual enough that I don't carry much bitterness about the marriage itself. What I carry bitterness about is what the divorce process accidentally uncovered. Because we owned marital property, and because a portion of my equity in Foster and Sons had, over the years, become entangled with shared assets through a home equity line we'd taken out against the business's growth, our divorce required a full financial discovery process. Both attorneys brought in forensic accountants to comb through everything, my personal finances, the business's finances, all of it, standard procedure for a business owner going through divorce. I remember feeling almost relieved at the time, thinking finally, someone with real expertise is going to look at these books line by line, because some small, stubborn part of me had never fully let go of my old doubts about Gary's timesheets. The forensic accountant's name was Patricia, and about 3 weeks into her review, she called me in for a meeting that started with her sliding a printed spreadsheet across the table and asking me one question. Who is Brittany Marsh, and can you tell me what work she performs for Foster and Sons? I told her I didn't know anyone by that name who worked for us. Patricia nodded like she'd expected that answer, and then she walked me through 11 years of payroll records, 3 names, 3 fabricated positions, and a total that made my stomach drop somewhere around the $200,000 mark before she'd even finished explaining the methodology. I sat in that conference room for almost 2 hours while Patricia walked me through the pattern. Brittany's deposits had gone into an account jointly held by Diane and her husband, Kevin's father. Cody's deposits, smaller and more sporadic, traced to an account that appeared to fund what looked like a teenager's car payments and phone bill for several years, which lined up with when Cody would have been finishing high school and starting community college. Gary's payments were the largest and most consistent, and Patricia had cross-referenced job site sign-in logs against his supposed hours and found gaps so large entire months where Gary was listed as working 40-hour weeks with zero corresponding sign-ins at any active project, that there was no plausible explanation left standing. Patricia had a particular way of talking, careful and unhurried, like she understood she was handing someone a grenade and wanted to make sure I had both hands free before she let go of it. At one point, she pulled up a chart she'd built showing total fraudulent payments by year, and the line climbed steadily almost every single year, from a few $1,000s in year one to nearly $30,000 a year by the final stretch, as Diane apparently grew more confident that no one was checking. "Whoever did this," Patricia said, tapping the screen, "understood your systems well enough to know exactly how much scrutiny each of these numbers would realistically get. This isn't opportunistic. This is someone who studied the business." I didn't need her to tell me who. I already knew, the way you know a shape in the dark before the light actually confirms it. I asked Patricia the question that had been sitting in my chest since she first slid that spreadsheet across the table. I asked her how a company with a real accounting department, a real office manager, real annual reviews, could have missed 3 ghost employees for 11 straight years. She told me something I've thought about constantly since. She said fraud like this rarely survives because it's clever. It survives because it's boring, because it hides inside routine, inside the parts of a business that everyone assumes someone else is checking. Nobody had been assuming anything malicious about Diane because nobody had reason to. She'd built trust for years before she ever asked anything of it. I confronted my father first, not Diane, because I needed to know how much of this he'd known or suspected. He hadn't known, not the scale of it, though he admitted quietly that he'd sometimes wondered about Gary's hours too and had let it go the same way I had, for the same reasons, not wanting to strain the family. Hearing that my father, a man who built this company with his own hands, had also swallowed his instincts to keep peace with Diane Marsh made something in me go very still and very cold. We'd both let this happen because we were both trying to be kind, and kindness had cost us over $200,000 and 11 years of quiet theft dressed up as family harmony. I called Diane myself, before the attorneys got involved formally, because some part of me wanted to hear what she'd say when it was just the two of us, mother and daughter-in-law, no lawyers translating the conversation into something colder. She didn't deny it, not really. She reframed it. She told me that Gary had helped out plenty over the years informally, that Cody was practically family and needed the support, that Brittany had done bookkeeping work here and there that never got properly logged. She talked about it like an accounting oversight, a paperwork technicality, not a decade of fabricated employees paid with money that should have gone toward crew wages, equipment, my father's retirement, my own children's college funds. I pushed back harder than I expected myself to. I asked her directly whether Cody had ever set foot on a single job site in the years he'd been on our payroll. There was a long pause before she said he'd helped load materials a few times when he was younger, which even by her own account didn't come close to explaining years of bi-weekly deposits. I asked about Brittany's supposed bookkeeping work, and Diane said Brittany had reviewed some things from home. A claim Patricia had already told me couldn't be substantiated by a single email, invoice, or work product anywhere in our systems. Every answer Diane gave got smaller and vaguer the more specifically I asked, and I could hear, underneath her voice, the particular flatness of someone who knows the story isn't holding, but is going to keep telling it anyway, because the alternative is admitting there was never a story at all. When I told her Patricia had already documented the total absence of any real work behind 2 of the 3 names, she got quiet, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "I did what any mother would do to make sure her family was taken care of." As if my family, the one actually named on the building, wasn't the family that mattered. I asked her if she understood that Gary's help and Cody's support had come directly out of money that should have funded real crew raises, my father's retirement contributions, equipment upgrades we delayed 2 years running because the numbers never quite worked. She didn't really answer that. She said she hoped this wouldn't have to affect her relationship with her grandchildren, which felt less like an apology and more like the opening move in a different negotiation entirely. The divorce attorneys turned the discovery over to my business attorney, who advised pursuing both a civil claim against Diane, Gary, and Brittany for restitution, and separately, a conversation with law enforcement about whether the pattern rose to criminal embezzlement given the scale and duration. That decision wasn't easy. Kevin, understandably, did not want his mother facing criminal charges, and for a while that became its own battlefield inside an already painful divorce. Whether pursuing this fully would blow up whatever co-parenting relationship we were trying to preserve for our kids' sake. I made a choice I still stand behind, even though it cost me things. I pursued the civil claim fully, working with my attorney to file suit against Anne, Gary, and Brittany, jointly for repayment of the documented fraudulent payments, with interest. I stopped short of pushing criminal charges, not out of mercy exactly, more because I calculated that a criminal case would take years, would center my children's grandmother in headlines in our small city, and would likely not recover the money any faster than a civil judgment would. Trisha's forensic report became the backbone of the case, airtight, dated, undeniable, 3 names with 0 corresponding work product against 11 years of deposits. Deanne settled rather than let it go to trial, which her own attorney apparently advised strongly given how thorough Patricia's documentation was. The settlement recovered about 70% of the total, paid out over 18 months, less than full restitution, but more than I expected once real negotiations started. Gary and Brittany were named as co-defendants, but had far less capacity to pay. And in the end, most of the burden landed on Deanne and her husband's shared assets, which I understand created its own quiet earthquake inside their marriage that I wasn't there to witness and don't feel entitled to comment on beyond that. Kevin didn't attend a single settlement conference, which I understood, and didn't defend his mother outright either, which surprised me more than it probably should have. The one real conversation we had about it, near the end of the divorce process, he told me he'd had his own suspicions about Gary over the years, smaller and vaguer than mine, never enough to act on, and that hearing the full scope from Patricia's report had genuinely shocked him. I believed him. I still believe him. Whatever else went wrong in our marriage, I don't think Kevin knew the size of what his mother had built, and watching him absorb that in real time, watching a grown man realize his own mother had been quietly stealing from his wife's family business for over a decade, was its own strange, sad thing to witness in the middle of an already ending marriage. Gary, for his part, paid his portion of the settlement in a lump sum almost immediately, which I later learned came from cashing out a small retirement account, and he sent me a handwritten letter, unprompted, that read less like an apology and more like an explanation of financial hardship in the years his name had first gone on our payroll. I didn't respond to it. Cody, who by then was in his mid-20s, reached out separately and asked if he could pay his portion back in monthly installments, which we agreed to, and which he has, to his credit, kept up with consistently in the 2 years since. Of the 3 of them, Cody is the only one I've since had anything resembling a normal conversation with, mostly because he seemed, even at 19, like someone who'd been placed inside an arrangement he didn't fully understand the ethics of at the time. Family gatherings look different now, as you'd expect. Kevin and I share custody of our kids, and we've actually managed to keep that part relatively functional, better than I expected during the worst months of the divorce. Diane still sees her grandchildren, though considerably less often, and always without me in the room. I've told my kids, in language appropriate for their ages, that Grandma Diane made a mistake with money that hurt our family business, without turning her into a villain in front of them. Because whatever she did to me, and to Foster and Sons, she's still their grandmother, and I don't think it's my job to make that relationship harder for 2 children who didn't do anything wrong. My father retired fully about 8 months after the settlement closed, sooner than he'd originally planned, and I think some of that was exhaustion, not just from the business, but from realizing how long he'd let a slow theft continue under his own roof, because confrontation felt worse than the alternative. He told me once, over coffee not long after he stepped back, that the thing he regretted most wasn't the money. It was that he'd taught me, without meaning to, that keeping the peace was worth more than asking hard questions, and that he watched me apply that lesson to Diane the same way he had, and neither of us caught it until a divorce attorney's forensic accountant forced the issue for us. I didn't have a good response to that. I still don't, really, except to say I've tried to unlearn it since. I run Foster and Sons alone now, with Lisa still beside me, and one of the first real changes I made was implementing a policy that no family member of any owner, officer, or manager can be placed on payroll without a documented job description, a direct supervisor's sign-off, and quarterly review by an outside bookkeeping service completely unaffiliated with anyone at the company. It's a small, bureaucratic thing, a policy nobody would notice unless they went looking for it. I've also started sitting in personally on every annual audit, not because I don't trust Lisa, but because I never again want to be the owner who can't answer a simple question about who's actually on her own payroll and why. I notice the policy every time I approve payroll now. I think about the $200,000, and I think about 11 years of choosing peace over instinct, and I don't plan on making that particular mistake again. Some nights I still catch myself running the math differently, wondering what that money could have become if it had stayed where it belonged, crew bonuses, a second office manager so Lisa wasn't stretched so thin, my father's retirement funded a little more comfortably instead of stretched thinner than it should have been in his final working years. I've mostly made peace with not knowing. What I haven't made peace with, and maybe never will, is how easy it was, how many separate moments over 11 years I had a chance to ask one more question and didn't, because the question felt smaller than the relationship I was afraid of damaging. I know better now. I built a whole company policy out of knowing better now. It cost more than I ever should have had to pay to learn it. If you think discovering your family business quietly funded your in-laws for over a decade is a strange way to end a marriage, you haven't heard what one bride's own bridesmaids accidentally revealed about her in a group chat she was never supposed to see.